Welcome back to our coverage of the Mackinac Policy Conference. One of the largest topics of conversation here has been about the crisis in Flint. And joining me now to talk about it is Congressman Dan Kildee. Congressman, it's good to see you.
Thank you.
I can imagine that you're walking through the Grand Hotel through this entire conference, and that is the main topic of conversation that people want to talk to you about. Give us an idea of where we are in Flint as it stands right now.
Well, I think, and these are the kinds of questions that I get. What's the situation in Flint? And, sadly, it's still really tough. People can't drink the water. Most people are still using bottled water. It's been at least 9 months between the time that this crisis became well known and today, and yet we still haven't seen real substantive action to provide Flint the resources for its recovery. And so a lot of the questions have to do with how things are going. My answer is they could be going a lot better if we just had the resources that we need to fix the problem.
All right, so let's talk about the resources. Coming from the state level, we're still waiting for some supplemental funding to come through the budget right now. But in Washington, it's also been very, very hard to move through any kind of legislation there for Flint either.
Right. Part of that has to do with the fact that most people acknowledge, virtually everybody who's been a close observer, that the crisis was driven by state action, even the governor's own task force.
So you're having a hard time lobbying for it?
Especially when the Michigan legislature has failed to act. When I go to my colleagues in Congress, they say, look, I understand we need to do something to help, but how do I get them to move at the federal level when they have less responsibility for what happened, when people at the state level have not yet taken action? It's not a good excuse, don't get me wrong. I think people in Flint have every right to expect their federal government to act, but it makes it much tougher when after 9 months, the state of Michigan, that is largely responsible for this crisis, has yet to provide Flint a relief package. It's kind of hard to argue that somebody else ought to step in front of where the state has continued to fail. And honestly, the hardest part for me is that it feels like the response to the crisis is the same way that basically the same circumstances that caused the crisis, almost indifference to what's happening to the people of Flint.
Well, the state might argue back, and when I say the state, the governor and the lieutenant governor might argue back and say, well, look, there was $28 million in January, $30 million for water bills, Medicaid expansion to the tune of $4 million, and we do have a plan. We have that money out there. We're just waiting for the legislature to move. Why do you think the legislature hasn't moved on that $128 million?
It's a good question. I mean, frankly, I think it's going to take leadership. I wish the governor would simply say one thing and make it very clear. The next bill that he will sign should be the Flint recovery bill. The legislature can do anything they want to do. If it is the highest priority, why continue to let it get kicked down the road, especially when there are consequences? So basically, if the state's going to provide $150 million or whatever the number is to help Flint recover, why not provide it now? Every day that passes, that money becomes less effective. Every day that passes, the hurdle gets bigger for the city of Flint and its people to overcome. So there's no moral justification, and there's no economic justification for continuing to wait and treat this like any other budget question that the state has to deal with. It's a crisis. When your house is on fire, you don't assemble a city council meeting to debate the efficacy of fire protection. You put out the fire. And that's what's happening in Flint. It's very frustrating.
I think something that money can't fix, which is an even bigger problem that they may have in Flint, is trust.
Yeah.
And you have a population of people who may never trust what any kind of government body tells them is okay. Again, a new poll came out that 70% of people in Flint still don't trust that filtered water is okay to drink.
Right.
And that is, I think, a very difficult thing to be able to deal with. It. You're going to need so much more, public campaigning?
Sure.
Door to door? How do you get people to say, it's believe you when you say it's okay?
Yeah, and this is where the response actually does fuel the trust gap. People don't trust the government because they keep hearing that there's all this help on the way, but it's really not here, and it's not showing up. And so in some ways, the promise of safe water, which was broken, has been followed by all sorts of promises to fix the problem that haven't occurred yet. So I think the only way we rebuild public trust is to act in such a way that is consistent with the rhetoric. Actually spend the money to fix the problem. It will still take time for people to be willing to accept anything that the government says, but there's a moral obligation to fix this problem. And as long as they continue to just talk, that public trust continues to be diminished.
Let's go ahead and take a look at a little bit of the bigger picture here in Michigan right now. How would you characterize the way the rest of the country perceives Michigan, how we're doing economically in terms of attracting business? Give me what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think the national economic recovery is too slow, and Michigan is not fully benefiting from even that recovery. I mean, we've seen a lot of data that shows the middle class is shrinking faster in Michigan than anywhere else. So we've got some big hurdles to overcome in this state. What I think people are looking for is to have a kind of optimism in this state that allows us the freedom to invest in our own future, to invest in better roads and better schools and vibrant cities. Rather than sort of waiting for the future to happen, I think people want to feel like we're making our own future, and I have not seen that. I haven't seen the state legislature or the governor act in that way.
Let me ask you a little bit about politics in the short time that we have left. Presidential-wise, people are talking that Michigan could be in play. That could go, that Donald Trump might be able to make some kind of, might be able to make waves here.
Sure.
Anyway, what do you think about that? What's been the conversation in Washington right now?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of concern about what Donald Trump represents. It's from my point of view and the point of view of a lot of people that I talk to, it's a frightening prospect that somebody who's so fast and loose and so cavalier, using language that would be in any other environment considered bigotry, that he's a legitimate candidate for president of the United States. I think ultimately in Michigan and across the country, when it comes down to actually voting for who we think should be the leader of the free world, it won't be somebody like Donald Trump that tries to marginalize whole populations. And I think right now people are expressing their disgust with the political system.
I was just going to say, because Congress does not have a great approval rating.
Terrible.
I mean, no one is thrilled with
Right.
what they consider to be the status quo. I think it's interesting, though, that in the ways that people then either take it out or they say, well, this is the solution. If the status quo is the solution, then he might be the solution.
And it's dangerous, that's the problem, to think that any change from what we know needs to be changed, that any change is a step in the right direction. Sometimes it's a change in the wrong direction. In the case of Donald Trump, my God in heaven, he cannot be the president of the United States. It would be disastrous.
All right, well, I'm going to ask you one final question that a lot of people have been asking around here. Are you running for governor in 2018?
Well, I'm going to give it a lot of thought. I mean, we get through this election cycle, hopefully elect a Democratic president, take back some seats in the House. I'll sit down with my family and think about whether it's the right path for me. But I will say this, I think a lot more about it now because I've come to understand in ways that I never have imagined I'd know how significant it is who sits in that chair. Just watching the Flint crisis unfold, we can't have a governor who will let that happen. I'll have to ask myself whether that means I run for governor. I'll make that decision after the next year.
All right, Congressman Dan Kildee, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.